Hello everyone, this is Professor Vedler, and this is the video lecture for History 231, Ancient Mediterranean World, and this is our number 15, which covers the Roman Republic between the years of about 133 to 55 BC, which is a very momentous and exciting time in Rome, and one we can be very glad we don't have to actually live through, because it got rather unpleasant. And this is the first thing I want to point out, and it's always a very interesting thing. The old saying is, may you live in interesting times. It's a curse. And some people say it's Chinese. I looked, and I'm not sure it's entirely Chinese, but it is true. Living in interesting times also means often living in unpleasant times. And one of the things that we find in Rome in this period, well, they were very interesting times, and they were also very unpleasant for a great many people, as we will see. So, the Roman Republic. Now, here's the first thing, and the main thing I want you to take from this. The Roman Republic is going to fail. I'm going to give you a spoiler alert right now. It will eventually fall apart. It will fail as a political institution. But the most interesting thing is it did not fail because of its failures. And that's the great irony. It did not fail because of its failures. It failed because of its success. Now, remember we talked last time about how Rome and Carthage had gone at it in two massive wars, and our friend Hannibal had ravaged Italy, and all sorts of unpleasantness had gone on then, and Hannibal and Carthage had eventually been defeated and then destroyed, and that was the end of the original Carthage. Eventually a city would be built again on the site, a Roman city, also called Carthage, so don't get confused between those two. But here's the thing, all right? The lesson that comes out of this is that frequently the biggest problems and dangers that you're going to face, not just politically, not just as a society, but individually, personally, in your lives, are not because of failures, but because of successes. Being able to deal with success is one of the hardest things any of us can ever do in our lives, all right? And that's something to keep in mind, because when things are going well and you're feeling successful, it's easy to let things slide. It's easy to ignore growing problems. And the reality of life is that there are always some problems somewhere. And if you can catch them early and nip them in the bud, you save yourself a lot of trouble later. Do people do this? No. Right now I'm giving this lecture from my apartment, and the reason I'm doing that is because of this coronavirus pandemic that's going on. Now, what would have happened if, let's say, 30 years ago, when the HIV epidemic broke out, if we had taken the diseases seriously instead of brushing them aside? We would have saved millions of lives from HIV, and we would have eventually put together institutions that could have helped at least mitigate some of the problems we're having now. But we didn't. We kicked the can up the street, and that's something that human beings do. And I am as guilty of this as any human being alive. So I'm the last person in the world that can point fingers. But the reality is that we all do this. When things are going well, we figure that the problems are not that big a deal, and we don't catch them early. So here's the thing. The Romans had incredible success. They defeated Hannibal, they conquered Carthage, they took control of the western Mediterranean, then they started expanding east against the Hellenistic Greek kingdoms. The descendants of Alexander's generals were ruling those, and the Romans one by one start bumping those off, until finally the only one left is Ptolemaic Egypt, all right, ruled by the Ptolemies down there in Egypt. Now here's the other thing. There were all sorts of other things happening as well, and a big one is Rome's food supply. Rome was getting its grain no longer from growing it in Italy like they had been. Instead, they're getting it from Egypt, which now means Egypt is incredibly important to Rome, and they've got to keep those grain shipments coming. What's happening in Italy? They're growing cash crops, and cash crops are always very profitable, but you can't survive on them. The biggest cash crop in America today is in fact marijuana. And I want to go on record here saying don't smoke marijuana. Don't eat marijuana. It's still illegal at the time this video is being made in most parts of the United States, so I want to officially say don't do marijuana. But the reality is more money comes in per acre of land growing marijuana than any other crop in the United States, and the reason for this is it gets you high, and people like to get high. I don't know why. I've been high. I took some prescription drugs in a hospital once, got really high. It was really unpleasant, so I don't encourage anyone to get high. I'm not sure it's a really good idea, but people do seem to like to do it. And so the Romans, well, they're going to grow cash crops, and for them, it's grapes, which turns into wine, which people drink to get hammered. So this is a shift that's starting to happen in Rome. And so here's the problem, all right? You're seeing massive changes in Italy. You're seeing massive changes. And the rich, the patricians, are getting richer, and the plebeians are getting poorer. You're seeing massive income inequality starting to come around. The other side is lots of war veterans from these wars Rome is fighting are going to start showing up as well. And here's the next lesson. No matter what you may think of war, or you may think of a particular war, do not disrespect veterans. Don't ever disrespect veterans. Take care of your veterans. And the reason you take care of your veterans is, number one, they have made great sacrifices on your behalf. Whether you approve of the war or not, they've made those sacrifices, and they need to be respected for that. And number two, from a more practical sense, they know how to kill you. You really don't want to make these people that unhappy. And this is something that societies sometimes do. They disrespect their veterans. And sure enough, this is what the Romans begin to do. They start to basically just blow off their veterans, all those plebeians. The plebeians get home from the war. Their farm has been taken away by their rich neighbor. They go to Rome, and what do? They get to Rome. It's a big, filthy, stinking city, and they're sitting there getting drunk. They're sitting there getting hammered, and they're thinking, gosh, my life really sucks. What's gone wrong here? And you start having a growing class of people in Rome who feel this way. Now, one person feeling this way, you can control. But then that person sits down next to another person, and they're both drinking, and they both discover they're veterans. And it's an interesting thing about veterans. They can always pick each other out of a crowd. And so these veterans start to talk, and they say, hey, I served in Spain. I served here. I served there. And the next thing you know, you've got 2 veterans, and then 10 veterans, and then 100 veterans, and then 1,000 veterans, all of whom know how to fight, all of whom know how to kill and make trouble, who don't have jobs because their farms have been taken away by their rich neighbors, and the rich neighbor's not hiring. He's using slave labor from these wars to staff his farm, to staff his estate, and he's growing cash crops. So this becomes a growing crisis. Now, the Romans are not stupid, okay? One thing, do not assume that when these kinds of problems happen, it happens because people are being stupid. All right, it's very easy to point at your leaders and say, oh my God, this guy's an idiot. The fact of the matter is, frequently, most of the time, leaders are actually smart people. These are not stupid people. All right, they get caught up in circumstances and they make poor choices because it might be correct, politically correct for the short term, but it is not a good idea in the long term. And this is what the Romans have been doing. They've been making what seemed like very reasonable choices for a while, and of course those choices are starting to go south. All right, and these patricians, they're getting richer. They don't want to give up their goodies, and this is causing problems. But the Romans are smart enough to say, hey, we've got a problem. We realize we've got a problem, and this is where we start to see the emergence of reformers. And reformers show up all the time. They always show up. Barack Obama would be a good example of a reformer. All right, he wanted to make changes to solve some of the problems that we have, some of the problems we're having today. He tried to solve them. He wasn't always successful, and let's face it, you can't entirely blame him because he was up against entrenched interests in the United States, all of whom were doing what made sense for them in the short term, and they weren't necessarily thinking long term because, hey, nobody does. We don't do that as a species. All right? So, Barack Obama is an example of an attempted reformer, and he tried very hard. He tried to reform the healthcare system, which of course is a train wreck right now, but he tried. He did his best, but he couldn't necessarily make it work. Now, the Romans are going to have the same kind of thing. They're going to have the same kinds of people. They're going to say, hey, we've got ourselves a problem here. There's too many of these poor veterans who have no jobs. They're really unhappy. They're dangerous. We got to do something about this. So what are we going to do? Well, into this situation step what we call reformers. These are people who say, we got a problem and we need to fix it. And the first reformers that we start to see in Rome are a couple of brothers. They're the Gracchi brothers. They are Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. Now, the Gracchi are the ultimate blue bloods. They come from the top of patrician society. These are not plebeians, but they recognize there's a big problem, and they say to themselves, we've got to solve this. All right. Now, there's 2 of them. They each have an interesting career here. They each have an interesting career. The first one is our friend Tiberius Gracchus. And Tiberius Gracchus says, we need land reform. We need to get these veterans and all these people out of Rome, back onto little farms, growing grain. We've got to go back to the way it was before. He's a conservative in this way, all right? And he's got a point, all right? That would be a really good thing if you can make it happen. And so Tiberius says, we need to make this happen. He gets himself elected tribune. Now, the role of tribune in ancient Rome was kind of the head of the plebeians. He was the guy who represents the plebeians. So even though this guy is a patrician, he is working for the plebeians. And he gets himself elected, and he says, we need to reform land. We need to reform the way land ownership and this sort of thing is done. And here's what he says. What we got to do is go back to the law. All right. The law says, and I'm going to read it to you, the law says that the maximum amount of land that any single citizen of Rome was allowed to own was about 120 hectares, which is a decent-sized farm. All right. But here's the thing. Nobody's paying attention to the law, and this is a warning sign. You may not like a law, any law, but you need to either follow it, protest against it, or change it. If you don't like a law, you protest against it, you change it, but you don't just blow it off. And this is what they've been doing. They've been blowing off this law, so these huge, huge estates controlled by these patricians are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they're illegal. And so what Gaius says, he says, hey man, what we got to do is just go back to the law, follow the law, split up these big estates. All right, let's split up these big estates. We put people back on little farms, we get them working again, and things will go back to the way they were before we had all of these problems. And remember, these problems are happening not because Rome failed, but because Rome was so successful. They were taking over everything in the Mediterranean as this is going on. And so this is what he sets out to do. Now, there are a couple of problems here. The first one is that Tiberius was not a schmoozer. Now, schmoozing is one of those wonderful words. You just got to love this word. And it's the ability to work a crowd. It's the ability to get along with people. And really talented politicians are really good at schmoozing. Bill Clinton was really good at schmoozing. Ronald Reagan was really good at schmoozing. These guys know how to get people to like them. And even if you disagree with them, you can't help but kind of like these guys. And that's what schmoozers do. Tiberius, he's not a schmoozer. He rubs people kind of the wrong way. And that's going to be a bit of a problem because it means that he's going to have a hard time getting popular support here. All right? He's going to try, and so he's going to try his reforms, but he's going to have a hard time getting popular support. So at this point, the last king of Pergamum dies, and talk about a cushy will this guy had. He leaves his entire kingdom to Rome. Boy, that's such a deal. Wouldn't you love to have a millionaire that you never even knew in your family die and leave you $1 million? Well, this guy left his whole kingdom to Rome. So this is a cash cow for Rome. And Tiberius says, hey, why don't we take this wonderful, wonderful opportunity and give the money to the plebeians and get them back working and so on and so forth. Now, that all sounds very reasonable, and reformers frequently sound very reasonable. The problem is this. There's always somebody that they're going to have to take something away from to make it work. Barack Obama, in order to make his plans work, had to take something away from people who didn't like having their stuff taken away. That's always the case. Every reformer in history has had to face this problem. All right? And so this is what we start to see here. All right? There was resistance to Tiberius among all those people who were making a lot of money in the current system. All right? And so this becomes a serious problem. So one day, in the summer of 133 BC, there are a bunch of meetings happening in Rome, and the plebeians are meeting over here, and the Senate is meeting over there, and all sorts of excitement is in the air. It's a hot day in Rome, and it's a very excited time. And then, well, a guy named Scipio Nascia, all right, Scipio Nascia, who was, well, here's a pun, nasty. Scipio Nascia was not a nice guy, and he's a consul, and he says, hey, I think Tiberius is a problem. And he says, I think Tiberius is going to try and seize power illegally. Now, you'll remember, seizing power illegally is the one thing that makes the Romans crazy. It makes them totally paranoid and nuts. So he says, this guy's going to try and seize power illegally. We got to stop him. Now they said, hey, okay, we got to calm down. Let's be reasonable. But this guy's not a reasonable guy here. And so the consul says, hey, let's not get out of hand. I'm sorry, this fellow Scipio was not a consul. The consul actually says, let's not get out of hand, but Scipio will not be dissuaded. He gathers his crowd of supporters together. He marched over to the Capitoline Hill, and they had a riot. Now, today, when you have riots, it usually means your team has won the Super Bowl, and you run around in the streets, and you yell and you scream, and maybe you'll smash some things, and you'll break some things, and that's kind of as far as it goes, because the police come in and they stop you, all right? Here's the thing. Americans are amateurs at rioting. We really are. We're not great rioters. The Romans, now they knew how to riot, because when they had a riot, people died. It gets violent. And so by the time the riot is over, 300 people have been killed, including Tiberius. He's been done in, and so he's out of the picture. Now, what does this mean? It means that, well, the situation has not been solved, and obviously people are still saying, hey, I don't think this is working. We still got to come up with a solution here. So Gaius Gracchus will now step up. And Gaius Gracchus, like Tiberius, comes from the blue bloods. He's a patrician, but he works really to try and help the plebeians. And he has something his brother did not have. He knows how to schmooze. He does have charisma. His speeches were apparently really excited because he had this thing about moving his hands all the time and jumping around. It was really entertaining and exciting. And that's always fun. And you wanted to go see the guy just for the show, even if you don't agree with him or whatever, but he would give these speeches. You get crowds worked up. So our friend Gaius is going to try and make this work as well. And he's a lot shrewder than his brother was. And so what he does is he says, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to come up with a way of making this work. We're going to play some politics here. We're going to get some people on our side, people with wealth, people with power on our side. And what we want to do is move power away from the patricians, the Senate, and those folks into the hands of more popular assemblies. And this seems to be his goal here, all right? And he works with a group called the Equites, all right? The equestrians. And the equestrians get a star. And who are these people? These people are the new rich. These are not the old rich families of the patricians. These are new rich. And these are people who've made a lot of money. Think about Bill Gates, right? Makes a lot of money himself. He didn't inherit money. He makes a lot of money himself. And this is what you would call an equestrian or equites. And what these guys basically did is they monopolized state contracts, which is really lucrative. You can make all kind of money if you can do this, right? So they would monopolize state contracts and they would say, hey, we're going to make lots of money, and with money comes power. And so what our friend Gaius does is he shovels money, he shifts money from the old systems into these new equestrians, gets them on his side, and one of the things he does is he says, let's let these guys do our tax collection. Now I want to take a little aside and talk a little bit about Roman tax collection. If you're like me, you have either just filed your taxes or you're getting ready to file your taxes, and if you're like me, it wasn't any fun. Let's face it, nobody likes paying taxes, all right? But the fact is, every state in the world has to take taxes in order to function. And everyone who runs around saying, let's cut taxes, let's cut taxes, let's cut taxes, that's great to a point. After that point, everything starts falling apart. All right, and this is something we are in a situation now. Our finances in the United States are in pretty tough shape because we keep cutting taxes and then we borrow the difference to spend on all these other things. And then an emergency comes along like this coronavirus thing, and we need to pump massive amounts, trillions of dollars into the economy, and there's no question but we got to do that. Where does that money come from? We just start printing it. That's all we can do because we're in an emergency. So right now I'm all for printing more money and flooding the economy with it, but that's only going to last until this crisis is over, and then we're going to pay some of that money back, and then what are we going to do? All right? Taxes are how you fund a lot of your government. So you may not like taxes, I sure don't, but hey, you got to have taxes. So how do we deal with taxes? Well, the Roman had a system of taxes that was one of the most screwed up in human history. You think our tax system's bad? You get mad at the IRS? Yeah, these guys had nothing on the Romans. The Romans had a thing called tax farming, and here's how tax farming would work. A rich guy, right, either a patrician or one of these equestrians, would go to the Roman government. He would say, hey, how much money can you collect from this place here? All right, and let's use modern terms. Let's say, okay, we can collect $10 million from this place here. So this guy would say, okay, great. I'll pay you $10 million up front. I'll hand it to you right now, and you give me the right to collect taxes in that province, and anything I collect there, I get to keep. And that means the Roman army backs me up when I go in to collect. What do you think this guy is going to do? He's interested in making a profit. So what is he going to do? He's going to take the army in, and he's going to extort more than $10 million to make his profit from that place. He's going to sponge the hell out of everybody, which means, of course, everyone suffers, and the economy locally gets trashed. But hey, the Roman government got their money, this guy makes his money, and hey, they're happy. And they've got the army on their side. What are you going to do about this? This was a disastrously bad method of collecting taxes. It was a catastrophe. It always has been. But it's what the Romans would do, at least at this time. They eventually would stop doing it because it really doesn't work. So old tax farming was one of the things. And so what this guy does, what Gaius does, he says, hey, I'm going to shovel these contracts over to my rich friends, making them a lot of money, making me a lot of influence in Rome, and using that influence, I can do my reforms and get those plebeians back on their farms out in the countryside. Yay, hooray, hurrah, our problems will be solved. Does this work? Well, remember, he's going to piss somebody off. And sure enough, he does. Eventually, the patricians who are getting screwed by all this say, we don't like this guy, and so they go after him. And eventually, he loses his position in the government, and he isn't able to get it back, and they have another riot. Now, remember what I said, the Romans were really good at rioting, all right? And the body count gets really high. So in this time, instead of 300 dead people, the riot gets so out of control, you get 3,000 dead people. 3,000 dead people in a riot. You can't imagine how nasty that must have been. And here's the thing, right? A fellow named Opimius, all right? One of the consuls has a servant, and this servant's name is Opimius, and Opimius gets killed. So Opimius, his servant gets killed. Opimius does not get killed, his servant gets killed, and Opimius says, hey, bring me the head of Gaius Gracchus, and I'll give you that weight of his head in gold. So some entrepreneurial Roman said, hey, good idea. He gets a hold of the head of Gaius Gracchus, he kills him, cuts off his head, and then he hauls out his brain, he fills it with lead, and he schleps it over here, and he hands it over and says, give me my money. And the guy pays him, which is just gross. This is just nasty, and we really don't ever want our politics in America or anywhere else on earth to get this nasty, but this is how nasty it is beginning to get in Rome. So now, great question. Did this solve the problem? The answer, no. But with that, I'm running out of video time, so I will pick up the rest of this story in the next couple of lectures, and I will see you all then.